Well, that's me. It's interesting to hear people's individual stories, and many of them are quite compelling. Certainly the ones that Dr. Korn presented and some others are rather sad and potentially sad when the personal story that Dr. Fairmont brought forward about her daughter-in-law. Everybody's got a story like that, and many years ago, my father, blessed memory, called me up and said, I need you to get me some more of that medication that you got for me. Well, we would get him occasional medication samples that we had that would be helpful, myself and my late wife, who was an internist. And I asked him, I said, well, which medication is this? My father at that point had macular degeneration, couldn't read a lot of things too well, and was hard of hearing, so he couldn't really hear particularly well. And he spent a fair amount of time listening to daytime television in the United States, which is replete with all sorts of interesting advertisements. I said, well, what medicine is it that you need? He goes, that Viagra. And I'm like, really? I said, I don't think I ever gave you Viagra. And he goes, sure you did. Give me a whole box. I'm thinking, if I had a whole box of Viagra, I don't know if I'd share it with my dad. So I said, well, I'm not really so sure. Let's figure this out here. What did I give it to you for? He goes, wow, you gave it to me for my nose. I said, well, unless you're Pinocchio, there's no real advantage to this medication. I said, do me a favor, get the box out of the garbage and just read to me what it said. It takes it out. Well, it turns out the drug was actually Allegra, which is an antihistamine. But this is a situation that obviously is compelling on many levels. Responsible people gave responsible people medication. Responsible person couldn't read particularly well, couldn't hear particularly well, and was sitting there watching television where every second commercial is either about a malpractice lawyer or Viagra. So you have to keep a lot of things in perspective when thinking about what it is that people need to focus on to make people safe with their medications. It's the doctor, it's the pharmacist, a lot of it is the patient, a lot of the patient family, and how they interact with one another, because mistakes are made, as was mentioned multiple times, at many, many levels. And the end user sometimes makes mistakes. They'll lump all their Monday medications in one place, but then don't have any for Tuesday. All these things need to be looked at. It's a rather multifactorial problem. But in any event, we're speaking about transparency today. And what prevents transparency of a quick and full access to the medical record? Now, we all know, and the basic premise under which we're working here is that if you don't have transparency in the records, you don't know what's going on. And there are many levels to transparency. For instance, someone coming for a procedure, informed consent. You need to be transparent. What could happen? If I do such and such? If you take this medicine, what should you expect? Well, what should you expect that could be problematic and that you should avoid? What should you let me know about? Transparency is really information transfer. And there are a lot of advantages. You want somebody who's fully competent to know what you're giving them, although we make the mistake often in thinking that the people are fully competent in understanding what we're telling them, and many times they're not. There are disadvantages. You don't want to tell people things that will necessarily scare them to death so that they won't take the medication that you think will help them. But you have to really be open with them and kind of walk that fine line. There's also issues of transparency from the patient end. What is a patient to do, and how does a patient undo something in the medical record that's patently untrue? I myself, for many, many years, was told I had a penicillin allergy until I got to medical school. And realizing allergic reactions, what they are, I asked my mother, I said, what was the nature of the allergy I got from penicillin? She said, oh, you had some diarrhea. Oh, okay, well, that didn't really help. And I ended up experimenting and taking amoxicillin, and I survived. And I realized I'm not pen allergic. Now, how do you undo that in someone's medical record? They have to have a proviso for that also. That's a level of transparency that's needed too. And Now, how it fits with our concerns about pharmacovigilance and how central it is to our effort. If we're not able to rely on the information we're getting, all these various lists and procedures are kind of like a waste of time. Transparency is a prerequisite for accountability. And at the end of the day, someone's got to be responsible for something, which is not says a lot, but it doesn't really carry a lot of weight in many societies. Accountability is a prerequisite for effective policy. You can have a policy, as we heard from the Ministry of Health, from Dana Arad, that have a whole bunch of remedies to do certain things. Not a single one of them is ever enforced. There's an issue there. There's a very, very big issue there, especially as relates to risk management. Effective policy is a prerequisite for successful outcomes. If you don't have a policy that's understandable, that's acceptable, that's enforceable, and the key is enforceable, you can never hope for successful outcomes because everybody's going to skirt the issue. Nobody is concerned that there's accountability at the end of the road, so what's the problem? Without transparency, the entire endeavor is at risk for being a waste of time and money. That has to be particularly well understood. And we have to rely on reliable records. How likely is it that effective safety changes could be made if the records we're looking at could be changed at will? How could you affect any positive change if post hoc the changes could be made to any part of the medical record? And think about it. Does your institution, do your regulatory agencies, does your legal environment guarantee medical record reliability? Now, it may say it does, may pretend to do so, but in fact, it may not. And you have to look at that very carefully and decide whether the information you're gathering and that you're going to put in that funnel and into that black box, whether it's a diagram or a Venn diagram, whether that's even worth the endeavor. Because before you do anything, the information has to be reliable. So let's review a fatal case. I've reviewed multiple other cases, but this is one that I'm pretty close to. In this case, drugs were administered with no record of an order. Drugs were administered with no record of withdrawal from stock, although there's a computerized device that's supposed to have a record, no record. Drugs were administered with no record of response in the doctor's notes. Drugs were administered with nurses' notes that were obviously excised. These are, by the way, electronic medical records. So you could say a paper note gets ripped out or gets replaced, and that may be true. In the case of electronic medical records, they could make all the changes they want. They're logged somewhere. And even if the program itself does not allow for these things, you can forensically go back and see when the registry was changed and look at the various spaces and find copies of what was supposedly erased. Nothing gets erased. In this case, there were also days of missing doctor's notes. This is from an electronic medical record printout. Days of doctor's notes missing. So maybe someone wrote something, and it's just not there now all of a sudden, or maybe they never wrote anything, in which case that's a pretty bad idea. They're missing consulting notes and missing operative notes. Where'd they go? There's no identified morbidity and mortality conference results. Now, nobody needs to know the names and things can be protected, but there's no result that comes out and says, we're going to change X and Y type of behavior. There's no hospital internal investigation, ever. No access to the original record source. By that record source, I mean not going to medical records and then giving you a pile of papers that says, here's your record. Because I did that, and I looked it over, and I said, well, where's the rest? No, I'm talking about access to the original source, which would be the computer. If it's electronic medical records, you need access to that computer. Now, no one's saying that you walk in and stick in your thumb drive and pull out. No, in a supervised fashion, you have somebody who's qualified, and you go and inspect to see what changes were made, when they were made. If there are changes, you can change a medical record. There's no reason not to change a medical record if information says there's some new information. But you got to say that, you know what I wrote before is different from the information I have now. That's legitimate. But to change it, no, not so much. And of course, there was no access to supporting surveillance documentation. We live in a pretty much surveilled society here, and there are cameras everywhere, and this stuff never goes away. Asking for that stuff should be de rigueur. It should be available. And it could validate what people say. Well, I gave this and this medication. I did such and such procedure. Okay, well, let's go to the videotape. And if you find that that's not the case, that's a problem. If you find that that is the case, things can happen despite the best efforts. There's no action by a government agency that regulates hospitals and doctors regarding record tampering or insufficiency. And as Dana mentioned yesterday, it's in their ambit to do that, but they just don't feel like it for whatever reason, so it doesn't get done. People suffer from that. The legal status of the chart. Now, this is an interesting thing that may be not unique to this country, but is kind of unique if you think about it. The primary source of truth, until proven unreliable, is the chart, okay? But you can't prove that the chart's unreliable until the court finds it unreliable, okay? But the court won't find it unreliable until another government agency finds it unreliable. Well, you notice that that's like the catch-22. It's the ultimate catch-22. There's a circle there that needs to be broken. So each one of these issues totally nullifies our attempts at improving the level of pharmacovigilance, as we just can't rely on the records to be truthful, at least in this case. I suspect that it's not universal in the country, and certainly there are people here who have been and continue to make efforts to make it not the case. But as was mentioned, there really, except for Ophir, there are no risk managers here. This is not something that they feel attracted to come to and discuss. And this is what limits true transparency, is risk management. Now, the generally accepted description of risk management in the Western world is a method wherein a problem is encountered, something happens, a sentinel event, the root cause is sought, and if it's found, not all sources can be found, it's examined, studied, followed by a plan of action to embed new systems and methods to prevent or mitigate the likelihood of adverse events from happening or recurring again. Now, we can't eliminate accidents, we can't eliminate tired residents, we can't eliminate a lot of things. We could try to mitigate it. But first you have to come to the conclusion that you have an issue. The problem is that too often the definition of risk management is corrupted and perverted, and it results in the following. A method wherein a problem is encountered, the root cause is sought, and if found, the records are altered to indicate the event never occurred. Problem solved. Oh, there you go. We've taken care of everything. Nothing happened. That's unacceptable because that results in people unnecessarily dying because of changes that could have been made upstream at an earlier time. And it's a sense that there's no willingness to get this done, which is more of a problem. The only way to obtain true transparency is with enforceable law mandating the unencumbered access to original source records by interested parties. And that means the ability of the court, either by court order or by standing regulatory directive, to say that, say in this case, patients or families, the regulatory bodies themselves, institutional review boards, and of course with the relevant cloaking, medical committees responsible for risk management oversight, including pharmacovigilance, should get access to original source records. It's not hard to do. It's not a big request. But the amount of resistance encountered to allowing that to happen in individual institutions suggests to you that there is a problem. If there was no problem, what's the big deal? Want to see your records? Go right ahead. If someone is standing in your way and preventing that from happening, that suggests, and it's quite obvious, that there's something that they don't want people to know. It's your records, you should know. If they're telling you you can't get access to them, how do you know what the truth is? How does anybody here who's going to be working and watching and helping people deal with their medication errors, prevent them from happening again, know that there's a problem if, by records, there is no problem? It's an unfortunate situation which can be remedied. I believe the starting point is people here who are going to remedy it. A lot of committed people, a lot of good people, and hopefully in short order, we'll be able to come back next year, have a lot of interested people, and a lot of thanks to Irene for pulling this all together. This has been a wonderful conference, really full of great, useful information. For a 2-day conference, this was chock full of helpful, useful, and positive information. And really, if you think about some of the lectures you've heard, this stuff breaks ground. And compared to some other conferences where a lot of the speakers simply kind of like break wind. But in any event, appreciate it and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Any questions?